I'm going to talk about brand architecture and naming architecture, and my company, Northbound, does a lot of that and does a lot of it in big tech, which means we're dealing with portfolios with thousands of products, usually hundreds of mergers and acquisitions, and like in the case of, I'll take Microsoft, the Azure portfolio alone is adding 800 names a year. And so managing that kind of innovation while still creating some consistency so that you're actually porting that equity back to your parent brand and not just creating lots of ways to spend brand investment is a challenge in and of itself. And I was to be joined by my client who lives in Brooklyn and is delightful, Tenny, but she got called into an executive emergency meeting. But today we're going to talk about our brand architecture work with Cisco. You all may know them for networking. They have a huge security portfolio. They also have something called observability. We can talk about what that is later. If you're not in tech, don't worry about it. They've got a WebEx unified communications portfolio and several other portfolios that they manage. And so we worked with them on brand architecture. We actually went portfolio by portfolio to sort of build a system and then vet that as we went in their different lines of business. And I think oftentimes when brand architecture comes up, we can think that it's house of brands or branded house. And I have to say, those two models are irrelevant in tech, completely irrelevant. It's overly simplified when you're talking about things that are purchased in a consumption basis, things that are purchased as services, and where, again, innovation is the name of the game. If there's 800 new products and features being introduced on an annual basis by a company, calling it a branded house feels like just so monolithic in its solution that it's not going to be manageable. You won't be able to govern it with your product marketing managers, which is where the rubber really hits the road. So, when we are talking about Cisco, this is just the acquisitions in their security portfolio, which is one of their smallest portfolios, in about a 4-year time span. So I just wanted to give a sense of like, what are we talking about? You can see it's name Palooza. There's acquisitions. Meraki is an acquisition they made about 10 years ago and never transitioned. And Cisco Secure, something they introduced to try to pull their portfolio together, but still taking equity from Cisco, not really transferring it back up to the mothership. So this is just a sense of the kind of cleanup that's needed in the portfolio. And then cleanup's just really the backwards work. Then how do you set up a system of governance moving forward? So as your product marketing and as your engineers are in that innovation mode or in an acquisition mode, that they have a structure to use to inform how they need to be creating names and creating hopefully not too many brands moving forward. So yes, we did need to simplify. The goal was really, let's put the emphasis on the Cisco brand. We want the equity to accrue to Cisco, which is a legacy brand and has some new relevance now in the era of AI, because they are actually the infrastructure that a lot of technologies in the AI era are running on and will be running on. But if we simplify too much, there's just no room for landing innovations or acquisitions. And in thinking about this work, actually, Tenny and I had a couple of conversations on what would we want to communicate as like the 3 biggest things you need to know before you tackle trying to organize and then set a governance structure for a big tech portfolio. And the first really is, this isn't a campaign. You won't come up with an architecture and then say, there we go, we're done, we're finished. This work is ongoing year after year, and it's really never over. In the case of some of our work with Microsoft, it's decades of governance, implementation, rejiggering. Oh, now we need to signal that we're in AI. Now we need to signal we're in the cloud. How are we going to deal with that? How does our structure help bring that forward while still putting the spotlight on the, in this case, Cisco brand? The second thing is, and anyone who's done any naming knows this, naming is emotional. And the engineer or the leader who's come up with the product, that's their professional pride. That's their career. That's a highlight for them. And to say, no, you can't have a trademark for that, or actually, we're going to call that Cisco, is a challenging conversation to manage. I believe decision-making is the hardest thing to manage in naming, much more than creative, and to some degree, more so than naming strategy. And so, understanding that careers and professional pride are very much attached to names and trying to redirect that conversation to, this is the strategy and what you're doing is amazing and here's how it's going to hit our business goals, rather than here's why your product deserves a trademark, is something you have to manage on an ongoing basis and you want to take into consideration when you're establishing your rules for governance. And then the third thing, and this never ceases to amaze me, at least in big tech, I'd be interested from others if this is true in other really sprawling categories, but naming is the fulcrum of all brand strategy at these organizations. And the reason is because product marketing and marketing operate in two separate but related orgs, and they come together as soon as they realize, I need a name for my thing, they start having conversations. And those conversations are, what's my TAM? What segment is most likely to be an early adopter of this? What category framing do I want to do? Am I an email solution or am I IM? How do I want to frame up what I'm offering to the market? And all of those come to a head through the naming door. And so you also have to be prepared in a system where you're governing naming to be able to tee up those conversations to ensure that a value prop is actually being established and you're not just picking and choosing naming solutions. So in the architecture work that we do at Northbound, we rarely go from architecture to naming. There's steps in between, right? So we will determine where an offering fits, what a structure should look like, what's a general framework for all of the offerings in the portfolio. Then we have this middle work, right? Establishing a taxonomy, creating structures and guidance for how you name, and then the actual naming itself, whether it's retrofitting or creating processes and guidelines for how to manage acquisitions in the future, and how to name and manage new innovations. So I'll go through each of these relatively quickly and at a super high level. In the case of Cisco, we did look at, it's really helpful to have metaphor, right? To try to evaluate what do I want to do. And so we used other big tech companies to talk, especially with leadership as we were trying to guide decision-making of here's what we mean when we say more monolithic or more flexible, and looked at Salesforce and Palo Alto as the two extremes there. Palo Alto having a lot of brands that they trademark and go to market with, almost to the point of the attention not being on Palo Alto and Palo Alto being more of an investor brand. And then you've got Salesforce, which probably many of you are familiar with, and a very simple and descriptive approach to naming. And for Cisco, we decided we wanted to be more like Salesforce. There's lots of exceptions in their sprawling portfolio, but that was really the model that leadership aligned with and that we felt strategically aligned with their business goals of reigniting Cisco from being a legacy brand to being more of a leader in this era of AI. This is really just to demonstrate the depth and level at which those conversations happened. It was months and months of going into the details of specific domain areas, specific kinds of tiering, and all kinds of different ways that that portfolio needs to be structured and navigated by customers. And this is the jumping off point where I could have had a 100-page presentation and it would have been diving into all of these nuts and bolts. But once we have the general architecture framework, then we'll move into a taxonomic structure. So what has happened, and we've again seen this at Microsoft, at Amazon, at Cisco, to some degree even at SAP, is if you're creating something in a business unit, you're calling it a platform, or you're calling it a product, or you're saying it's a feature. And there's no real unity in how people are using those labels. What you call a service, this person calls a capability. What that person calls a feature, you vehemently argue, that's actually a product. It shows up on a bill. This is a product. And so one of the very important steps after establishing a framework, which is still sort of theoretical, is let's agree on a common language. Let's have a taxonomy that we can all align to. So what is our definition of a platform? What belongs in it? What doesn't belong in it? What is our definition of a suite? Do we even need a suite? I'm actually having that conversation with another client who's here in New York right now. You don't need some of these layers, right? What's a capability? What's a product? What's a service? How do you define that? And then as you go across the top, it's not just what it is, but what are examples of that in our portfolio so you can say, oh, I am like that. And then how do you treat your branding? Because ideally, each layer in your taxonomy snaps to some brand. So you're not creating a new name every time. You're actually attaching to existing equity and expanding it. And then we'll have naming guidance that comes along with this, and even some example messaging to say, this is how your layer in the portfolio operates. And when we get to guidelines and guidance, we'll have ways to identify what you are against this taxonomy. And another middle step is creating structures, kind of pre-built ways we want to think about naming. So oftentimes in descriptive naming, there's actually a lot of choices. I think a lot of us think of, when someone says naming, we think of trademark, we think of creative naming, which is delightful and so much fun. But in a portfolio like Cisco, you're really talking about how do I manage descriptive naming? And in particular, how do I manage descriptive naming when I'm naming something over here in networking and it's a lot like this other thing that's in security? And we have some common ground. We actually have some anchor terms that everybody uses out in the market. How do we make sure we're calling them different things, but not so different that they sound contradictory, right? And so we go through a process to create a naming structure. It is by each taxonomic layer, and then there may be other nuances to that depending on the complexity of the portfolio. And that becomes kind of prescriptive guidance for here's how you attach to industry terms, here's how you make sure you signal what you are, and how you relate to the other products that sit in your sister portfolio that you might not be that worried about, but that your customer is going to encounter and needs to understand, how do I find my way to what I really need in this portfolio? And then we land with naming. That's the fun part. So that does result in really fun, creative naming sometimes. Ideally, like 2% of the portfolio ends up with a trademark. I think that's roughly the number for the Azure portfolio. Cisco, it's a little higher because they're still transitioning quite a few acquisitions. And ideally, you're really building equity into that mothership. So Cisco's on its way. I'd say we did this work, initiated this work 2.5 years ago, and it's ongoing. It's still happening. We're still meeting with a variety of folks across the organization and helping really coach them into why You want your specialness to not be your name, but to be your product and your message, and how to align and really build that equity into the Cisco brand. And when, on rare occasion, 2%, to send out the anchor point, do create a trademark, but make sure you're bringing along the mothership with you. So, thank you.
I'm Rupali with Meta Design. So as you presented sort of you made it look really simple, but I know how difficult it is going through the same thing. So I just wanted to say that it looks really simple, but behind it is a lot of hard work. So congratulations.
Thank you.
Thanks. I was wondering whether to ask it later. I just met Sam before she went up. Jason Hutt at Brand Pie, and we were joking that brand architecture is like the sexy part of brand strategy, right? And it does take a ton of work, so congratulations. I'm just curious, you said it took 2.5 years, and it just requires so much institutional knowledge, which, as you know, is ongoing and ongoing. How many people are working on this sort of at Northbound behind the scenes? Is it just you, or are there other people that are coming in?
Yeah, I mean, at Northbound, it ends up being a team that will expand and contract depending on where we are. The initial push of work is about 5 people. Northbound's a small company. I'm heavily involved, and this is work that I love doing. But we'll have someone who maybe specializes in sort of naming structure, like really structured thinking. We'll have more of a naming strategist and creative involved. We'll have someone with a brand strategy skill set, so more along positioning, value prop creation to ensure we're thinking in that way. I'll bring that skill set, and I probably stretch across those. And then we'll have some project management. The hardest part in some of these projects early on is planting the right seeds with the stakeholders across the organization, so by the time you get to workshop 1, they're like, oh yeah, that's my idea. And so that often takes some manpower as well. Yeah, thank you.